James West had been traveling for work for many years, always taking flights that were long and tiring. As a successful businessman, he had grown accustomed to the comforts of business class. The wide, cushioned seats, the quiet atmosphere, and the impeccable service were all part of what made the travel experience more bearable. But this time, as he walked into the busy airport terminal, something felt different. It wasn't the usual travel bustle he had grown used to, but something was off. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. The check-in area was packed with passengers, all trying to get their boarding passes and get to their gates. James stood in line, his sharp suit and confident posture making him look every bit the successful entrepreneur that he was. He wasn't the type to let the crowds bother him, and his calm demeanor kept him focused on the task at hand. When it was finally his turn at the check-in desk, he smiled politely at the attendant, a young woman with short brown hair and glasses. "Good morning," James said, his voice steady as he handed over his passport and ticket. "I'm here for the 10:30 flight to New York." The attendant nodded, glancing at his ticket before typing a few details into the computer. There was a brief pause as she looked up at him again, her face neutral. "I see you've been booked for business class," she said, tapping a few more keys. "Unfortunately, it looks like we're overbooked for that class. We don't have a seat available for you there." James felt a small flicker of surprise, but quickly masked it with a polite smile. "What do you mean, overbooked?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "I've always had a confirmed seat in business class for this flight." The attendant glanced nervously at her screen again, and then at James, who was clearly not angry but beginning to feel the unfamiliar discomfort of being told no. "I'm sorry, sir. I understand, but there's nothing we can do. The flight is full in business class, and we can offer you a seat in economy." James paused for a moment, considering his options. He had flown with this airline countless times, and each time he had been treated with the utmost respect. This didn't sit well with him. Was there a mix-up? Perhaps a mistake with the reservation? Or was something else going on? "I'm afraid I can't accept that," he said, his voice a little firmer now, but still calm. "I specifically booked a business class seat." The attendant, sensing his frustration, began typing more quickly on her keyboard. "I understand, sir. Let me see if we can arrange something. I'll check with my manager." James nodded and stepped aside, watching as the attendant made a few phone calls and exchanged a few words with her manager. The minutes felt longer than they were. He could hear the bustle of the busy airport behind him, the sounds of people talking, the announcements blaring overhead, and the rustling of bags. But none of it helped to ease the unsettling feeling growing in the pit of his stomach. He had been in this situation before, where airlines were overcrowded, or there had been a technical glitch with the booking system. But there was always a solution. However, this situation was beginning to feel like something more than just a mistake. After a few minutes, the attendant returned, a strained smile on her face. "I'm afraid we really have no business class seats available. The best we can offer is a seat in economy. I can give you a complimentary meal voucher, but that's all we can do at the moment." James was quiet for a moment, trying to process what was happening. He could feel the growing tension in his chest. The air around him suddenly felt thick with the unspoken discomfort of the situation. Something didn't feel right. But instead of voicing any frustration, he took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his tone measured. "I've flown this route multiple times and never had an issue with my seat before. You can look at my past flights, my membership status. I should be in business class." The attendant seemed to hesitate, her eyes shifting nervously, as if she were unsure of what to say. There was something in the way she looked at him now, and James noticed it, something more than just the usual customer service concern. She looked at him as though she was unsure of what kind of customer she was dealing with, perhaps unsure of how to handle the situation. "I'm sorry, sir," she said again, her voice growing quieter. "I really don't know what happened. I'll try to resolve this." James felt his patience wearing thin, but he also knew that staying calm and composed would be his best option. After all, he was not just a businessman, but someone who had worked hard to get to where he was. He knew that reactions in moments like these could affect the course of things. Yet this wasn't just about business class seats or a simple error in booking. It felt like something deeper, something that touched on the prejudice he had often experienced, even in the business world. As he stood there, waiting for the next steps, James couldn't help but think about how many other people, less confident or with less patience, might not be treated fairly in a similar situation. He was no stranger to the challenges faced by people of color in the corporate world, but this was a reminder that even in something as simple as a flight, the effects of racial bias could make an appearance. With a calm, steady breath, he made his decision. He would get to the bottom of this, one way or another. James walked away from the check-in desk, his mind working through the strange situation. As he made his way through the crowded terminal, he could feel the energy around him. People rushing to their gates, the distant murmur of announcements, and the hurried steps of travelers. But despite the noise and movement, a quiet tension settled inside him. The more he thought about it, the more his gut told him something wasn't right. He had been traveling for years and had never encountered such a mix-up. He glanced at his watch. The flight was still over an hour away, but his calm demeanor had been shaken. There was a nagging feeling in his chest, like he had missed something. Had this ever happened to him before? It wasn't just the seat issue. It was the way the staff had treated him, the way they spoke to him, the way they had hesitated when he had calmly asked for a solution. Something about the entire interaction felt off, as if they were treating him differently than they would treat another passenger. James understood that sometimes things went wrong during air travel. Flights were overbooked, mistakes happened, or the airline simply couldn't accommodate all the demands. That was a given in an industry that dealt with thousands of passengers each day. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random mistake. As he made his way toward the departure gate, he scanned the busy area, watching families, business travelers, and tourists all moving in different directions. He observed them all, looking at how they interacted with the staff, how they were treated. People seemed to flow in and out of the line, either unaware of the complexities of the situation or unconcerned by the small hassles of air travel. But for James, everything felt like it was under a microscope. He reached the gate and joined the line for boarding. The attendant at the counter looked at him with the same nervousness as before. The woman had apologized earlier, but James could see the discomfort still lingering in her expression. She knew there was something she hadn't handled right, and now she was trying to avoid another encounter. James didn't want to make a scene, but the situation continued to feel more like a personal challenge than a mere inconvenience. The line moved slowly, and as James inched closer to the counter, he started to wonder if he should just let it go. Maybe it was simply an error. Maybe the staff was under pressure, or maybe there had been a mistake with his ticket. The more he thought about it, the more frustrated he became. The situation wasn't just a seat mix-up. It was beginning to feel like an assumption based on his appearance. That uneasy feeling from earlier crept back into his mind. Why was he being treated this way? He stood quietly for a few moments, trying to regain his composure. Deep down, he knew that reacting out of frustration wouldn't help. He had learned over the years that staying calm and collected was often the best response in these situations. But the longer the minutes stretched on, the harder it became to hold on to his patience. The people around him were going about their business without noticing the tension in the air. Families were chatting excitedly about their vacations. Business people were buried in their laptops, and the sounds of the busy terminal continued around him. Yet for James, the feeling of isolation grew stronger. He was a successful businessman, someone used to being in charge and managing big deals. But here, in this moment, he felt as though his worth had been minimized, as though his presence didn't quite fit the role the airline expected of a customer. Finally, it was his turn to speak with the gate attendant. She looked up and gave him a quick, polite smile. James took a deep breath, his voice calm but carrying a quiet edge of frustration. "I'm not sure why I'm being treated like this," he said. "I've traveled this route many times, and I've always been in business class. I don't understand what the problem is." The attendant's face shifted slightly, and for a moment, she didn't respond right away. Instead, she fiddled with her computer screen, her fingers hesitating over the keys. James watched her closely, his eyes narrowing. He could see the discomfort in her movements, as if she didn't know how to explain the situation any further. "I'm really sorry, sir," she said again, glancing at her screen. "But as I mentioned, business class is full. We cannot accommodate you there." James was silent for a moment, thinking carefully. "Can you at least look into this further?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. "I've paid for a business class ticket, and I expect to receive that seat." The attendant seemed to pause, and James felt his patience thinning. Was she ignoring him? Was it something about him that made them believe he wasn't entitled to the seat he paid for? He knew it wasn't just a question of comfort anymore. This was about respect. It was about being recognized for who he was and what he had accomplished, not just as a businessman, but as a person deserving of the same treatment as anyone else. He realized that in this moment, the seat wasn't just about luxury. It was about standing his ground and refusing to accept the possibility that his worth was being undervalued because of assumptions about his race or status. "Please check again," he insisted, his tone still calm but now carrying an unspoken firmness. "This isn't just about a seat. It's about the way you're treating me. I don't think I'm asking for too much." The attendant's eyes flicked nervously between James and her computer screen, but after a few more tense moments, she excused herself and walked toward her supervisor. James could only stand there, watching the exchange, his mind swirling with thoughts. How many other times had this sort of thing happened, and how many others had just walked away, unsure of how to speak up? He wasn't going to let that happen. Not today. James stood at the gate, feeling the growing sense of frustration gnawing at him. It wasn't just the situation. It was the way everything had unfolded. He had come to expect a certain level of professionalism when flying, especially with an airline he had trusted for so many years. But today, something about this experience felt different. The longer he stood there, the more he could feel his patience wearing thin. His mind raced as he thought about the numerous flights he'd taken, the numerous times he had smoothly navigated through check-ins, security, and boarding. Business class had always been a comfortable and familiar space for him. Yet here he was, treated as if he didn't belong, like his seat wasn't meant for someone like him. Even though he hadn't raised his voice or shown any outward signs of frustration, he couldn't shake the feeling that his request was being dismissed simply because of who he was. He had worked hard to get where he was in life, building his company from the ground up, overcoming obstacles, and carving out a place for himself in a competitive business world. And yet, here he was, at the mercy of an airline employee who was unable or unwilling to resolve a simple issue. The attendant had walked off to speak to her supervisor, leaving James standing alone. The minutes dragged on, and he couldn't help but notice how the people around him seemed to move with ease, oblivious to the tension in the air. Families were still chatting about their travels, business people were still typing away on their laptops, and the overhead announcements continued with the same robotic tone. But for James, every second that ticked by felt like an eternity. He glanced around the gate area, looking at the other passengers. There were some who seemed equally impatient, others who were lost in their phones, and a few who were having quiet conversations. The scene looked normal, like any other airport, but James couldn't stop feeling like he was the one singled out. Was it because of the way he looked? The color of his skin? Was it possible that the staff was simply treating him this way because of unconscious bias, or was it something more blatant? He had seen it before in business meetings, at conferences, and in boardrooms. The subtle shift in energy when he walked into a room. The way people hesitated before speaking to him or doubted his qualifications, simply because of their assumptions about him. But this was different. This wasn't a business meeting or a corporate event. This was a simple flight, a service he had paid for and had the right to access. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to stay calm. There was no point in getting worked up over something he couldn't control right now, but it was hard not to feel disrespected. He wasn't some random passenger. He had made his reservation months in advance, had paid for a business class seat, and had every right to expect to receive that seat. A few moments later, the attendant returned, walking quickly toward the counter. She was now accompanied by a man in a suit who James assumed was her supervisor. The man looked at James and then down at his screen, his face a mixture of professionalism and concern. James could sense that they were both aware of the uncomfortable situation that had unfolded, but neither one of them seemed to have the answers he was looking for. "We're very sorry for the inconvenience, sir," the supervisor began, his voice polite but lacking the genuine warmth that might have made James feel that the situation was being taken seriously. "It seems there's been a misunderstanding with your reservation. Unfortunately, there are no business class seats available, but we can offer you a seat in economy class as we've already mentioned." James couldn't hide his disappointment. He had been hoping for a different outcome. "I don't understand," he said, his voice steady, but tinged with the frustration he had been holding back. "I booked this flight months ago, and I've flown with this airline many times before. Why is this happening now?" The supervisor shuffled a few papers, his brow furrowing as if he were struggling to come up with an explanation. "We've had some issues with overbooking. Sometimes passengers make changes to their reservations at the last minute, which leads to these sorts of problems." James raised an eyebrow. "Overbooking. I understand that things happen, but I paid for a specific seat. I didn't make any last-minute changes, and I expect to be treated the same as any other passenger who paid for a business class ticket." The supervisor nodded, his eyes avoiding James for a moment. "I understand your frustration, sir, but as I mentioned, business class is unavailable at the moment. The best we can offer is economy, and we'll provide you with a meal voucher as compensation." James felt his jaw tighten, but he refused to give in to his growing anger. He knew that losing his temper wouldn't solve anything, but it was hard to remain calm when he felt like he was being brushed off. "I'm not asking for special treatment," James said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm asking for the service I paid for. I've been flying with your airline for years, and this is how I'm treated. Something's wrong with this picture." The supervisor's expression softened slightly, and he glanced over at the attendant, who was standing quietly behind him. She looked almost relieved that James wasn't escalating the situation further, but her discomfort was still palpable. James had a feeling she knew exactly what was going on, and he was starting to get a clearer picture as well. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about respect. It was about being seen for who he was, not just as a businessman, but as a person who deserved to be treated with dignity and fairness. He wasn't asking for anything more than what was rightfully his. "I'll need to speak with someone in charge," James said, his tone unwavering. "This isn't just about a seat on a plane. This is about how your airline handles these situations." The supervisor seemed to hesitate, but after a moment, he nodded. "Of course, sir. I'll arrange for someone to meet with you." James wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to walk away without having his voice heard. This wasn't just about him. It was about making sure that others didn't face the same unfair treatment in the future. As James stood there waiting, he could feel the tension building inside him. The supervisor had walked away to make another phone call, leaving him standing alone at the gate. James glanced around the busy terminal again, noticing how everyone else seemed to be oblivious to the situation unfolding in front of him. The other passengers were either lost in their phones or chatting with their companions, unaware of the growing frustration that James was beginning to feel. He didn't like feeling this way. He was usually calm and collected, someone who was used to handling difficult situations with ease. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It was something deeper. It felt as though his request, his presence, wasn't being taken seriously, and that thought bothered him more than he cared to admit. The minutes seemed to drag on, each second heavier than the last. James checked his watch again. He was starting to feel like he was being treated like an afterthought, just another passenger who could be ignored. He had booked this flight in advance, paid for his ticket, and done everything the airline had asked of him. Yet here he was, still waiting for a resolution. When the supervisor returned, he was accompanied by a tall man in a sharp suit. The man looked familiar, and for a moment, James couldn't quite place him. But as the two men approached him, the supervisor introduced the newcomer with a slight gesture. "This is Mr. Anderson, our operations manager," the supervisor said, his voice cautious. "He'll be able to assist you further with your reservation." James nodded, his eyes locking onto Mr. Anderson. The man was composed, but there was a certain unease in his posture, as though he too knew that something wasn't quite right about this situation. He extended a hand to James, and after a brief moment of hesitation, James shook it firmly. "Mr. West, I'm sorry for the inconvenience you've experienced today," Mr. Anderson said, his tone polite but distant. "I understand there's been some confusion regarding your seating arrangement. I'd like to assure you that we're doing everything we can to resolve this issue." James didn't return the usual pleasantries. Instead, he simply looked at Mr. Anderson, his gaze unwavering. "I don't understand how something like this can happen," he said quietly. "I've been flying with your airline for years, and this is the first time I've ever encountered an issue like this. I'm not asking for anything special. I just want the seat I paid for." Mr. Anderson glanced at the supervisor for a brief moment before turning back to James. "I understand, sir," he said, nodding. "The issue is that our business class is overbooked. Unfortunately, we don't have a seat for you in that section right now." James felt his frustration rising again. "That's not an explanation," he said, his voice still calm but firm. "I made a reservation for a specific seat. I didn't ask for special treatment. I just want what I paid for." There was a slight pause as Mr. Anderson processed James's words. He seemed to be searching for the right thing to say, but there was a momentary hesitation in his eyes. It wasn't lost on James. He had dealt with business negotiations enough to recognize when someone was trying to avoid the truth. "Let me make a call to our reservations department," Mr. Anderson finally said. "I'll see if there's a way to sort this out." James nodded, his arms crossed in front of him as he waited. As Mr. Anderson walked off, James felt a mix of anger and disappointment. He wasn't angry at the supervisor or the attendants. They were just following protocol. He was angry at the system, at the underlying issues that allowed situations like this to happen. He had worked hard to get where he was in life. No one had handed him anything. He had built his business from the ground up. Every success had been earned through years of hard work, determination, and perseverance. And yet it seemed that every time he stepped into a space where people didn't recognize him, he had to prove himself all over again. Whether it was in a meeting room, at a conference, or now, here at this gate, he was constantly reminded that, for some people, his presence didn't hold the same weight as someone else's. A few moments later, Mr. Anderson returned, a slight frown on his face. "I'm afraid there's nothing we can do, Mr. West," he said, his voice now tinged with frustration. "The flight is completely booked, and there's no room in business class for you. However, we can offer you a complimentary upgrade for your next flight, along with a voucher for the inconvenience." James couldn't believe it. After all the waiting, after everything that had transpired, this was the solution they were offering him. He couldn't help but feel insulted. He had asked for nothing more than what he was entitled to. And yet, here he was, being offered a voucher for a future flight. That wasn't the point. The point was that he had been wronged in the first place. "I appreciate the offer," James said, his tone cold, "but that's not going to resolve this. I've already paid for the service I expected to receive today, not tomorrow." Mr. Anderson looked uncomfortable, and James could tell that the man was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. He wasn't just dealing with a dissatisfied customer. He was dealing with someone who understood the value of their time and their money. "I'll make sure this is escalated to the right department," Mr. Anderson said, his voice quieter now. "We take these matters seriously." James simply nodded, but he wasn't sure whether or not he believed him. The damage had already been done. This wasn't just about the seat. It was about the way he had been treated. And he wasn't sure that any apology or compensation would make up for that. As he made his way to the boarding area, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just an isolated incident. This was a reflection of something larger, something that affected not just him, but countless others who were treated as less than they deserved. As James settled into his seat in economy class, a feeling of unease lingered over him. The plane had started to fill up, with passengers taking their places, and the hum of the engines grew louder as the flight began to taxi down the runway. But despite the motion of the plane, James couldn't shake the discomfort that had settled in his chest. His mind kept returning to the conversation with Mr. Anderson and the way the situation had unfolded. The seat he was sitting in was not the one he had paid for. It wasn't just about the physical space. It was about the principle. He had gone through the entire booking process, choosing a business class seat for the comfort and the benefits it provided. And yet here he was, wedged into a smaller, less comfortable seat with the noise of the economy section around him. It wasn't just the inconvenience. It was the message that had been sent to him. As the plane took off, James stared out the window, watching the ground grow smaller below. His thoughts began to drift, and he found himself reflecting on the way people often treated others in the business world. In his years of experience, he had faced many challenges, but this situation felt different. It wasn't about a simple customer service issue. It felt like a reminder that no matter how far he had come, there were still people who would question his right to be where he was. He had worked so hard to get to this point in his life. He had built his company from the ground up, learning from every mistake and setback. And yet, no matter how successful he became, he was still treated as though he had to prove himself. He wasn't naive. He knew that the business world could be challenging, and he knew that prejudice existed in many forms. But this was a stark reminder that even in situations where money and status should speak for themselves, there was still a lingering doubt about his worth. James shifted in his seat, trying to get comfortable. He had been flying for years, but he couldn't remember ever feeling so out of place. The economy section was filled with families, tourists, and other business travelers, but there was a distinct feeling of being disconnected from the group around him. He couldn't help but feel that the difference wasn't just about the seat. It was about the way people viewed him. It was a silent judgment, an assumption that his place in business class was a mistake. As the flight continued, James found himself becoming more reflective. He thought about all the times he had faced similar challenges, both in his personal and professional life. There were countless moments where he had been underestimated or ignored, and yet he had always managed to rise above it. But today felt different. Today, he wasn't just dealing with an airline's mistake. He was dealing with a deeper issue that reflected the biases and prejudices that many people still carried, whether consciously or unconsciously. He had spoken up in the moment, but now, as the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, James found himself questioning what more he could do. He knew that simply voicing his concerns wouldn't be enough. Change required action, and it required persistence. He couldn't let this incident slide without taking steps to address it, not just for himself, but for anyone who might find themselves in a similar situation in the future. It was then that James made a decision. He would use his voice, his platform, and his resources to bring attention to the issue. He had already made a name for himself as a businessman, and he had the ability to influence change. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about one instance of poor customer service. This was about a larger problem, one that affected many people, especially those who had to fight harder to be recognized for their achievements. As the flight continued, James began to think about how he could turn this situation into something positive. He wasn't going to let this be just another frustrating experience that faded into the background. He was going to speak out. He would bring attention to the way customers were treated, especially people of color who faced biases every day, both in the business world and beyond. By the time the plane began its descent into New York, James had made up his mind. He would take this matter further. He would reach out to the airline and demand accountability, not just for his situation, but for the countless others who were likely being treated the same way. He knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but he also knew that if people didn't speak up, things would never improve. His experience, though frustrating and unfair, could be the spark that ignited a larger conversation about how businesses needed to treat their customers with respect, regardless of their race, background, or appearance. When the plane finally touched down, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just a passenger in the airline system. He was someone who had the power to make a difference. And as he made his way through the airport, he thought about all the people who would never speak up, who would just accept being treated as second-class passengers. He couldn't accept that for himself, and he wouldn't let others accept it either. The moment he reached his destination, he took out his phone and began drafting a message. He would write to the airline's leadership, explaining exactly what had happened, what he had experienced, and how it needed to change. It was time to turn this negative experience into something that could help others. James was done being quiet. He wasn't just going to accept it. He was going to make sure that his voice was heard. After the flight landed and James made his way to his hotel, he felt the weight of the day's events lingering. He had expected the flight to be a normal part of his routine, but instead, it had become a reminder of how people sometimes underestimated him based on assumptions. The discomfort he felt wasn't just about the seat. It was about the treatment he had received. It was about the way his concerns had been dismissed, as if they weren't important enough to address. As he checked into his hotel room, James took a deep breath, trying to let go of the frustration. He'd spent the last several hours thinking about the situation, trying to process everything that had happened. The more he reflected, the more certain he became that something had to change. He couldn't let this go. Not after everything he had worked for. Not after the many obstacles he had overcome. James wasn't someone who easily let things slide. He knew that staying silent wouldn't help anyone, not himself, and certainly not the countless others who may have been treated unfairly in similar situations. It was clear to him now, the issue wasn't just a simple misunderstanding or a small glitch in the system. It was a symptom of a larger problem. A problem that affected countless people, especially those who weren't given the benefit of the doubt because of their race, background, or appearance. He sat down at the desk in his hotel room, pulling out his laptop. His mind was racing with thoughts. What could he do next? What would be the most effective way to address the airline's behavior and the broader issue of discrimination that he felt was at play? He started typing an email to the airline's customer service department. But as he began to explain what had happened, he realized that he couldn't just leave it at that. This wasn't just about him being denied a seat in business class. It was about a problem that needed to be addressed on a larger scale. It wasn't enough to point out the mistake. It was necessary to bring attention to the broader issue of how customers, especially people of color, were often treated differently based on assumptions. He carefully drafted a message that was firm but respectful. He wanted to make sure the airline understood that this wasn't a case of one simple mistake, but rather an instance of systemic issues that needed to be tackled. It wasn't about getting an apology or a voucher for a future flight. It was about making sure this didn't happen to others in the future. James felt a sense of determination growing within him as he wrote. He wasn't going to just let the incident fade away into the background. He knew that taking action was the only way to create real change. He needed to make sure the airline's leadership understood the impact their staff's behavior had on their customers, especially those who had experienced discrimination or bias in the past. He finished the email and took a moment to read it over, making sure it reflected his thoughts clearly and professionally. When he was satisfied with the message, he hit send, feeling a small sense of relief wash over him. But he knew that sending an email wasn't the end of it. The response he received would be just as important. He wasn't going to settle for a simple apology or a generic response. He would hold them accountable. Over the next few days, James received an email response from the airline. The tone was apologetic, acknowledging the mistake and offering him compensation. But as James read through the message, he realized that it still didn't address the core issue. It was a polite, surface-level apology that seemed more like a standard response than an acknowledgement of the deeper problem at hand. He wasn't satisfied. The apology didn't go far enough, and the issue of discrimination wasn't even mentioned. James knew that what he needed wasn't just an apology. What he needed was a commitment to change. He needed to make sure that the airline took responsibility for their actions and that their staff received the training and guidance they needed to recognize and address biases. James wasn't one to back down. He decided to take further action. Reaching out to the airline's senior leadership, he carefully crafted a letter, addressing the issue head-on. He explained how the situation made him feel, but also emphasized that this was not just a personal issue. It was a systemic one that affected many passengers, particularly those who were often overlooked or treated unfairly because of their race. He sent the letter to the airline's CEO and other executives, hoping they would take the matter seriously. He knew that real change often required persistence. He wasn't going to let this issue slip under the radar. Several weeks later, James received a call from the airline's senior leadership team. They had taken his concerns seriously and wanted to discuss how they could improve their policies and training to prevent similar incidents in the future. The call was a turning point for James. It wasn't just about his experience anymore. It was about making sure that people who had been treated unfairly, like him, would no longer have to face the same kind of disrespect. During the conversation, the airline's leadership team explained that they were already working on implementing new diversity and inclusion training for all of their employees. They also acknowledged the need to address unconscious bias in their customer service practices. James felt a small sense of satisfaction, but he knew that true change would only come when those changes were fully implemented across the company. As the conversation came to an end, James realized that while the process of change could be slow, this was a step in the right direction. It wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a start. He had raised his voice, he had made himself heard, and he had taken a stand. In the end, it wasn't just about the seat he had been denied. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to go through the same thing. James sat back in his chair, feeling a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't always easy to speak up, but he knew that he had done the right thing. His journey wasn't over, but for now, he felt like he had made a difference. James woke up early the next morning with a sense of purpose. The events from the previous day had been exhausting, but they had also sparked something inside him, a desire to see real change. As he sat down for breakfast at his hotel, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from the airline's customer service department. He opened it eagerly, hoping for a response to the letter he had sent to their senior leadership. The email was brief but reassuring. The airline's leadership had reviewed his concerns, and they were now planning to meet with him to discuss how they could improve their customer service practices and prevent incidents like the one he had experienced. It wasn't the quick solution he had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. He had made an impact. The fact that they were willing to meet with him showed that they were taking his concerns seriously. James smiled to himself, feeling a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't every day that someone in his position had the chance to influence change on such a large scale. He had often thought about how businesses could do more to address systemic issues like bias and discrimination, but now he had a real opportunity to be a part of that change. He knew that this wouldn't be easy and that the road ahead might be long, but he was ready for it. The meeting with the airline's leadership took place a few days later. As James entered the conference room, He was greeted by several members of the airline's senior management team, including the CEO. They were all warm and welcoming, and James could sense that they were genuinely interested in hearing his perspective. The meeting began with a few introductions, and then the CEO addressed the room. "Mr. West, we want to thank you for taking the time to meet with us today," the CEO said, smiling politely. "We've reviewed the details of your experience, and we deeply regret that you were treated this way. We understand the seriousness of the issue, and we want to make sure this doesn't happen again." James nodded, but he wasn't about to let them off the hook too easily. "I appreciate your apology," he said, his tone calm but firm. "But the issue goes beyond one incident. This is about a systemic problem that affects a lot of people, not just me. I've seen how people of color are sometimes treated differently. And it's not just about the seat. It's about the assumptions that are made based on appearance, and the way people are overlooked or dismissed because of it." The room fell silent for a moment, and James could tell that his words had struck a chord with the leadership team. They seemed to be taking it all in, processing what he was saying. The CEO, who had been silent for a few moments, spoke up again. "You're absolutely right, Mr. West," he said. "This is not just about one person or one experience. It's about the broader culture within our company, and the way our staff is trained to interact with customers. We've realized that we need to do more to address unconscious bias and ensure that all customers are treated fairly, no matter who they are." James felt a sense of relief hearing those words. For the first time since this entire situation began, he felt like someone was really listening to him. The airline's leadership wasn't just brushing him off. They were acknowledging the problem and committing to making changes. "We've already started working with diversity and inclusion consultants," the CEO continued. "We're going to implement new training programs that focus on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. We're also going to look at our hiring practices to ensure that our staff reflects the diverse communities we serve." James was encouraged by what he was hearing, but he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. "I'm glad to hear that you're taking this seriously," he said. "But I want to see real action. I want to know that this isn't just something you're saying to placate me, but something that's going to make a real difference for all your customers." The CEO nodded, looking thoughtful. "We understand, Mr. West," he said. "And we agree with you. We're committed to making these changes, and we want you to be a part of the process. We'd like to work with you to help shape the new training programs and ensure that they're effective." James was surprised by the offer, but he knew it was an opportunity he couldn't pass up. This was his chance to make a lasting impact, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been treated unfairly in the past. "I'd be happy to help," he said, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "But I want to make sure that the changes are truly meaningful. We can't just talk about diversity and inclusion. We have to put it into practice." The meeting went on for another hour as they discussed specific steps the airline would take, including implementing new policies, creating a more inclusive customer experience, and making sure their staff had the tools they needed to recognize and address bias. James felt encouraged by the direction the conversation was going, and as the meeting concluded, he knew that they were genuinely committed to making things right. As he left the conference room, James couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't easy to speak up, to push for change, but he had done it. And now he had the opportunity to be part of something bigger. He wasn't just a passenger on a flight anymore. He was someone who had made a difference, who had used his voice to bring about real change. James knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more work to do, more challenges to face. But for now, he felt proud of what he had achieved. He had taken a stand, and in doing so, he had helped create a path for others to follow. The weeks that followed were full of changes for both James and the airline. What started as a frustrating incident had turned into something much larger, a catalyst for progress. James was more determined than ever to ensure that the airline followed through on its promises to improve their customer service and address the issue of discrimination head-on. He knew that this was his chance to make a lasting difference, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been unfairly treated by companies in the past. As part of the new initiative, James worked closely with the airline's leadership and their team of diversity and inclusion consultants. They began developing new training programs aimed at raising awareness of unconscious bias among staff and teaching employees how to create a more inclusive and respectful environment for all customers. James was often involved in brainstorming sessions, sharing his experiences and providing valuable insight into what changes needed to be made. In one of their meetings, James was asked to help shape the training materials. He worked with the consultants to create scenarios and case studies based on real-life experiences, including his own, to help the staff understand the impact that bias could have on their interactions with passengers. These training programs were designed to not only change the way employees thought about diversity, but also to teach them how to act on that understanding to ensure fairness for everyone. While working on the training program, James also suggested that the airline start conducting regular employee evaluations, focused not just on performance, but also on their ability to communicate effectively with people from different backgrounds. He believed that by making this an ongoing effort, the airline could create a culture of inclusivity that would become ingrained in their way of doing business. The airline's leadership was eager to take action, but James knew that their success would depend on how well these new practices were implemented and how committed the staff was to embracing the changes. It wasn't enough to simply roll out a new training program. The real work would begin when employees began putting these lessons into practice in their everyday interactions with passengers. He made sure to emphasize this point during their discussions, stressing that the real challenge lay in changing the mindset of people who were already set in their ways. Months passed, and slowly but surely, James began to see the changes taking shape. The airline launched its new diversity and inclusion program, and the first round of training began. James was invited to attend one of the sessions to observe and provide feedback. As he sat in the room with the employees, watching them engage with the materials, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The staff seemed genuinely interested in learning and improving, and many of them spoke up about their own experiences and biases, realizing that they, too, had things to work on. This was a significant shift, and James could tell that the culture was slowly but surely changing. But even with all these positive changes, James knew that it was important to keep the conversation going. He didn't want the issue of discrimination to fade into the background once the training programs were completed. He made it a point to continue working with the airline, checking in regularly to see how the new practices were being applied in real-world situations. One day, a few months after the new training program had been launched, James received a call from the airline's customer service department. They wanted to share some good news. The company had seen a noticeable improvement in customer satisfaction, particularly among passengers who had previously reported feeling overlooked or treated unfairly. The airline's leadership was thrilled with the results, and they credited the changes in training and employee attitudes for the improvement. James was pleased to hear this, but he also knew that there was still more work to be done. While the initial results were promising, he understood that it would take time for the full impact of these changes to be realized. He continued to work with the airline, helping them refine their approach and make sure that the lessons learned during the training were being applied consistently across all levels of the company. As the months turned into a year, James began to hear more and more stories from passengers who had positive experiences with the airline, experiences where they felt valued and respected, regardless of their race, background, or appearance. He took pride in knowing that his efforts had contributed to these changes. He had not only stood up for himself, but he had also used his voice to make a difference for others. Through his work with the airline, James realized that one person could indeed make a difference. By speaking up, by demanding better treatment, and by pushing for change, he had been able to influence a major corporation to take responsibility for its actions and improve the way it treated its customers. It wasn't an easy journey, and there had been moments of doubt along the way. But in the end, he had succeeded in creating a lasting impact. James knew that there was still much to be done in the fight against discrimination, not just in the airline industry, but in society as a whole. He was determined to keep pushing for change, to keep speaking out when things weren't right, and to keep making a difference wherever he could. As he looked back on the journey that had started with a simple flight, James couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. The frustrations he had felt on that day, the unfairness he had experienced, had led him to something much greater, a movement toward fairness, equality, and respect. And in the end, that was worth far more than any seat on a plane could ever offer.